It was an ordinary day at a small diner in the heart of the city, where people went about their business as usual, chatting over coffee, savoring greasy burgers, and flipping through newspapers. But for one single mom, this was about to turn into the moment of a lifetime. A moment that would change her life in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. As she wiped down tables and moved between the kitchen and the dining area, she had no idea that someone extraordinary was about to walk through the door. This wasn't just any customer. No, it was none other than Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball player, TV personality, and global icon. But to her, he was just a big guy with an even bigger presence, sitting there like any other regular diner, ordering his food and waiting for his meal. Shaq had been on the road, working on his various business ventures, and decided to stop in for a bite to eat at this humble little diner. He was just another face in the crowd, enjoying a rare moment of peace, away from the flashing lights and the paparazzi. But to her, it felt like a whirlwind had just swept through the door. This wasn't the first time she had served someone famous. The diner had seen its fair share of celebrities passing through, but none had made her heart skip a beat like Shaq. She tried to maintain her composure, not wanting to make it obvious that she was starstruck. But when he smiled at her from across the room, it was hard to ignore the fact that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She had seen him on TV, watched his games, and even admired his philanthropy. Now, he was sitting right in front of her, and all she could do was serve him like any other customer. As she approached his table with his order, she noticed that he wasn't just any regular guy. Shaq had this aura about him. His sheer size was enough to command attention, but it was the way he carried himself, humble and approachable, that truly made him stand out. His easygoing personality and warm smile made it feel like you were talking to an old friend, not a towering sports legend. They exchanged pleasantries as she placed the food in front of him. She couldn't help but admire the gentle way he spoke, the kindness in his eyes. And then, out of nowhere, he did something that left her utterly speechless. With a sudden grin, he handed her a folded piece of paper, a note. She took it hesitantly, unsure of what was happening. But when she unfolded the note and began reading it, something inside of her shifted. The words on the paper weren't just any note of appreciation or a simple thank you for serving him. No, this was something deeper. Something that touched her soul. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she read the note, the weight of it slowly sinking in. It wasn't just the kindness of the words that overwhelmed her, it was the gesture itself. This was Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had seen the highs and lows of fame. Yet he took the time to connect with a single mom in a small diner. A moment like this, something so simple yet so powerful, was exactly what she needed. Life had not been easy for her. As a single mother, she had struggled, juggled jobs, and worked tirelessly to make ends meet. But this small act of kindness made her feel seen, valued, and heard in a way that no paycheck or material possession could. The emotions began to flood her as she stood there, holding the note in her hands. Her eyes welled with tears, and a lump formed in her throat. She had been through so much in her life, and at that moment, she felt like she was finally being recognized. Not as just a waitress or a mother struggling to get by, but as a person. Someone who mattered. But just when she thought the moment couldn't get any more emotional, something unexpected happened. Shaquille O'Neal, in all his greatness, stood up and walked over to her. His giant frame towered over her, but in that moment, he wasn't just a basketball legend. He was a human being offering something much more valuable than any amount of fame or fortune. What did he say next? How did this interaction unfold? What was it that left this single mom so overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion? The story doesn't end here, and the surprises were just beginning. Hold on, because this heartfelt journey is far from over. As Shaquille O'Neal made his way toward her, she was frozen in place. The note still clutched in her hand, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Could it be real? Did he really just do that? This wasn't the way things usually worked. In the diner business, people came and went. Famous faces occasionally sat at the booths, but no one ever went out of their way to make a connection, to really see her, as Shaq seemed to. She had always kept her head down, working tirelessly to make ends meet, balancing late shifts and parenting her young child alone. She had learned to accept that life wasn't going to give her much. But Shaq's gesture, it was more than just an unexpected surprise. It felt like a spark of hope in the midst of her struggles. Her thoughts scattered as he stood before her. His presence was larger than life, but it was his kindness that truly captured her attention. He wasn't a stranger to the hardships of life. He had made it to the top, but he hadn't forgotten where he came from. She had heard about his charitable work and the way he used his wealth and influence to help those in need. Yet, standing in front of him, she couldn't quite comprehend why someone of his stature would care about a waitress working a shift at a small-town diner. "Hey," Shaq said, his voice warm and steady, "I just wanted to say something." His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, the noise of the diner seemed to fade into the background. It was just the two of them in that moment. She wiped a tear from her cheek, trying to steady herself. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure of what else to say. Shaquille smiled gently and took a step closer, his voice lowering just enough to feel personal. "No. Thank you for what you do. I see you. I know what it's like to have a lot of weight on your shoulders, but you keep going, even when things seem tough. That's strength." Her heart skipped a beat. His words, simple yet so profound, resonated with a part of her that she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She had been so focused on survival for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be acknowledged as more than just a mother or a worker. Shaq saw her not just as a face behind the counter, but as a person. A person with her own struggles, her own dreams, and her own worth. But just as quickly as he had reached out to her, the reality of her situation came crashing back. She could feel the weight of her life, the financial struggles, the fear of never being able to provide enough for her child, the loneliness that seemed to always follow her home at the end of the day. The note, still in her hand, felt like an anchor. She wanted to believe that things could be different, that someone like Shaquille O'Neal could see the worth in her and offer something to help her out of the rut she was in. But she was hesitant to allow herself to hope. Hope had often felt like an illusion, something just out of reach. "You're a single mom, right?" Shaq asked, his voice gentle but full of understanding. "I know what that's like. My mom raised me on her own, and she worked harder than anyone I know. I'm just paying it forward. I see the way you're doing everything you can for your kid. It's not easy, but you're doing it." Her heart twisted in her chest. It was like he was looking straight into her soul, understanding her struggles without needing to ask a single question. She had always tried to keep up the facade of strength. But in front of him, she felt vulnerable, exposed. His words hit her in a way that few people's words ever had. "I'm trying," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's so hard sometimes. It's like, no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. My kid deserves better. I just don't know if I can give it to him." Shaq's expression softened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another folded piece of paper, this time handing it to her without a word. Her hands trembled as she took it, almost afraid to look at it. Could it be another note? Another gesture of kindness? Or was he simply pitying her? When she unfolded it, she gasped. It wasn't just a note this time. Inside the paper was a check. A large check, one that could change everything for her. It was for a substantial amount of money, something that could cover her rent for months, pay off bills that had piled up, and maybe even give her the breathing room to take a break, something she had longed for but never allowed herself to have. Her hands shook as she stared at the check in disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball icon, the philanthropist, had just handed her a lifeline. But the emotions flooding her were complicated. A part of her was overwhelmed with gratitude, but another part felt an unfamiliar pang of shame. Was this charity? Was she just another person Shaq was helping because he could? Did it diminish her strength, her fight to survive on her own? She wanted to scream out that she didn't need anyone's help, that she could do it alone. But another part of her, a quieter voice, reminded her that this was more than just charity. This was someone seeing her, acknowledging her struggles, and wanting to help in a meaningful way. Shaq hadn't just handed her money, he had handed her a chance. A chance to keep going, to keep fighting for her family, to give her child a better future. Her tears flowed freely now, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and confusion. She didn't know what to say. Words felt too small, too insignificant in the face of this overwhelming kindness. She looked up at him, her heart full of so many emotions, but there was one thought that echoed above all others. Could this be real? Could she really have a chance to change her life? The diner suddenly felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in around her. Was this the break she had been waiting for? Or was it just another fleeting moment of kindness in a world that could never quite offer her enough? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. Shaquille O'Neal had just given her more than money. He had given her hope. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder if that was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But as she stared at the check, a new question loomed on the horizon. Was this really the answer to her problems? Or was it just the beginning of something even bigger? Something she wasn't prepared for? The suspense was almost unbearable. Would she be able to take this gift and turn her life around? Or was this moment going to be a bittersweet reminder of everything she hadn't yet accomplished? As she stood there holding the check, her mind raced in 1,000 different directions. Was this really it? Was this the moment her life would finally turn around? Or was she just caught up in the whirlwind of an unexpected gesture from someone far out of her league? She looked up at Shaq, who was quietly watching her, his expression one of patience and understanding. There was no rush, no pressure. He was simply there, offering his support in the most generous way. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, but the words didn't come. Instead, she just stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Could she really take this help? Could she let go of her pride long enough to accept the kindness of a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all? But the truth was, it wasn't just a check. It was an opportunity. An opportunity she had dreamed of for so long but never thought would be within reach. Shaquille O'Neal had changed her perspective in that single moment. She thought of her child, of the dreams she had of providing a better life, of the moments when she had doubted herself. She had worked so hard, but it was never enough. She had told herself that she had to do it all alone, that asking for help was a weakness. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about weakness. Maybe this was about strength, about recognizing when you needed a hand, and being brave enough to accept it. The realization hit her hard, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to relax just a little. She didn't have to carry everything alone. And maybe that was the real lesson Shaq was offering her. Not just the check, but the permission to believe that things could change. The permission to ask for help, to lean on others when life became too heavy. With a trembling hand, she turned the check over, her eyes tracing the digits once more. This wasn't charity. This was someone believing in her potential. Shaq had been where she was. He had faced obstacles and challenges, and yet, he had risen above them. And now, he was giving her the chance to do the same. It was the push she had needed to take the leap. Her thoughts were interrupted as Shaq spoke again. "You got this," he said simply, his words calm yet full of belief. "Take care of yourself and your kid, and don't forget to look after you too." The weight of his words settled deep in her heart, and suddenly, everything clicked. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and the possibility of change didn't seem so far away. In that moment, everything seemed more within reach than it had in years. As Shaquille O'Neal stood to leave, he flashed her a warm smile and gave her a small nod. "Take care of yourself," he repeated, and with that he was gone. The diner, once filled with chatter and clinking plates, seemed quieter now, more peaceful. She stood there for a moment, still holding the check in her hands, trying to fully absorb what had just happened. The other patrons in the diner had watched the whole exchange in awe, some of them silently offering their congratulations or a nod of recognition. But she didn't need their validation. She didn't need anyone to tell her she had done something extraordinary. Because deep down, she knew this moment wasn't about fame or fortune, it was about hope. Hope that no matter how tough life got, there were moments of light that could help you keep going. In the weeks that followed, she used the money from Shaq to catch up on bills, buy new clothes for her child, and even take a little time off to recharge. The weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think about the future, not with fear, but with possibility. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. Shaquille O'Neal had given her more than just financial support. He had given her the gift of belief. A belief in herself, in her worth, and in the power of kindness. It was a lesson she would carry with her always. And while the world might never know the full extent of how one small moment changed her life, she would always remember that the heart of true strength was knowing when to ask for help and when to open herself to the generosity of others. The single mom who had once struggled to get by was no longer defined by her hardships. She was now a woman who had learned that strength wasn't just about standing alone. It was about standing together, helping one another when the weight of life became too much to bear. And as she watched her child smile up at her, she knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, with the same determination and resilience that had carried her this far. Her story, Shaq's kindness, and the lessons learned would stay with her for the rest of her life. And while the diner would eventually return to its routine and Shaq's visit would fade into memory, the impact of that simple gesture would live on in ways she couldn't even begin to measure. Sometimes the smallest moments could create the biggest changes, and for her, this was one of those moments. a moment of hope, of transformation, and of unshakable belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow.